So, there's a reason I'm wearing the Stevie Nicks shirt today. You see, I was adopted as a kid. For the longest time, I didn't know who my biological mother or father were. And, as a kid growing up, you kind of always wonder about that thing. Like, who are your parents? Where did you come from? Uh, where are you going? That kind of thing. When you're kind of a bastard child, fatherless, motherless, you wonder what your destiny is. You wonder who you are. Now, when I was a kid, I remember watching an old show that would come on at night called Midnight Special, and there was a band called Fleetwood Mac that played on the show, and they had a singer. And at the time, I was enthralled with the singer because I thought that she looked exactly like I did as a child, and that was Stevie Nicks. And so as a kid, I built up this fantasy in my head that my real mom was Stevie Nicks, and she had given me up for adoption so she could be a rock star. And I ended up telling everybody in elementary school that my real mother was Stevie Nicks and that she had given me up for adoption to become a rock star. I don't know if anybody believed it. They certainly could not disprove it. So I went with the fantasy. And another thing that happened was I'm old enough to have been that I was in 1977. I was just a small kid, and I remember my friend took me to his birthday party, and his birthday party was opening night at the screening of Star Wars when it first came to Fairbanks, Alaska. I grew up in Fairbanks, Alaska as a little child, and I remember the scene where Obi-Wan Kenobi told Luke that Darth Vader had hunted down and killed his father. And my adopted mind, with the way that I just thought in general, I thought in my head, no, Darth Vader is Luke's father. Because I just assumed that every bastard child had a huge destiny and was probably the son or daughter of, either the greatest hero in the world or the worst villain in the world. And so I just assumed that Darth Vader was Luke's father. And I went back to elementary school and I told all the kids my theory that Darth Vader is Luke's father. And, they're like, no, that can't be. That's just not true. That's crazy talk. You already tried to fool us with the whole Stevie Nicks is your mother thing, and why would we believe that Darth Vader is Luke's father? You're just crazy Durfee. You're just a crazy Durfee. That's all you are, is a crazy Durfee. Well, the reason I wore this shirt today is in honor of all the bastard children that have thought that their mother was Stevie Nicks and their father was Darth Vader, and we're going to review Game of Thrones today, the first book. And there is a bastard child in Game of Thrones that, Jon Snow, that kind of is the crux of the show. Now, let me read you. This is by way of introduction, and I do this at the beginning of every video, but this time I did this little prologue about Stevie Nicks and Darth Vader being my parents. But I am Brian Lee Durfee. I am the author of The Forgetting Moon, published by Simon & Schuster Saga Press. This is my channel where I review books, movies, and music. And today we're going to be reviewing Game of Thrones. And we're going to be talking about a lot of stuff about George R.R. Martin and the times that I met him and things like that. But let me read to you the acknowledgement page of my book, my first ever novel published, Forgetting Moon. Introduction and acknowledgments. Let me take off my glasses to do this. As someone who was adopted and knows nothing of his biological heritage, I've always been drawn to the heroic quest tales of orphans and bastards. Luke Skywalker was my favorite as a kid. Then came Terry Brooks' Shea Ohmsford, Lloyd Alexander's Turan, David Eddings' Garion, Robert Jordan's Randall Thor, Tad Williams Simon, George R.R. Martin's Jon Snow, and countless others. One might say these stories are in my blood. Mysterious blood, that is. I have never met a blood relative, and to always feel unattached and adrift in the world is a unique thing indeed. Sometimes the anonymity is worn with pride, other times sorrow. Ever since I was a teen, I aimed to explore these themes in a fantasy story of my own. So as you read this series to its conclusion, beware, assume nothing, trust no one, for in the end, do any of us ever know who we truly are? Do any of us ever show our true selves to the world? So that's the introduction I put in my own novel, because I'll be honest, as a kid growing up, the books that I read about orphans and bastards meant a lot to me. I know it's a trope, it's a tired trope, the orphan farm boy with the destiny and the prophecy that he's going to kill the Dark Lord. A lot of people are tired of it. It was right up my alley. These tropes meant a lot to me. These orphans and like Luke Skywalker and Jon Snow, they meant a lot to me as a young adult and in college and things like that. And so I appreciate these authors that appropriated my heritage as an orphan bastard and put them in their stories. And since I am an actual orphan, adopted, a bastard, don't know his heritage, I felt it appropriate that I write a fantasy series about just such a person. So in my own series, I subvert those tropes and everything else like that. Now, that's enough about me. That's enough about, who may or may not have been my parents. Let's talk about Game of Thrones. And the first thing I want to tell you is I have, as being an author, and I've also been an illustrator. I used to paint a lot for Dungeons and Dragons and Magic the Gathering. So I used to go to a lot of conventions, gaming conventions, science fiction conventions around the world for my artwork and also for my books. Now, back in 1997, when I was still in college, I used to paint for Magic the Gathering, and me and my friend, a writer friend I have named David Farland, he wrote the Runelorn series. We hopped on a plane and we decided we were going to attend the World Science Fiction Convention in San Antonio, Texas. And so I set up a booth in the convention hall with some of my artwork and some of my Magic the Gathering cards, and I was signing stuff and everything. And in 97, that was just when Game of Thrones was brand new. Not a lot of people have read it, but I was reading it. I took that book actually with me on the plane to read. And in fact, this is the copy that I took. This is my first edition Game of Thrones. I had this book with me in my booth, and I was reading it, and a little guy stopped by, a bearded little guy with, it was George R.R. Martin. You know what he looks like. And I said, hey, man, I'm reading your book. I think it's fantastic. I was about 2/3 of the way through it. And nobody knew who he was at the time. This was way before the Game of Thrones got really, really popular. And he ended up, signing my copy. You can see the signature there, probably somewhere. He ended up signing my copy of the book, and I had about an hour-long conversation with him about his characters and how awesome I thought his book was. And I don't think anybody had really talked to him about it at that point. I mean, nowadays, you go to George R. R. Martin shows up to a convention, he's going to have 2,000, 3,000, 10,000 people in a line, and he's not going to be able to talk to hardly anybody or give anybody much time. But I really got to sit and talk with him for a little bit, and it was fascinating. I thought it was, I did not know that it was going to be the phenomenon that it was, and so I was really fortunate to meet him at the time. My cat is going to jump on the shelf here in a minute, so if everything comes tumbling down, just understand that this is low budget. There's no graphics. All we have here are the background props. Speaking of background props, also at that convention in San Antonio in 97, my booth was right next to a guy who made swords and knives, and he was selling just thousands of swords and knives in the booth next to me. And I had a painting up, and I was eyeballing that painting for the entire convention, and he at the end of the convention he said, hey, I'd like to buy that painting from you. And I said, Mel, I would rather just trade you one of your swords, because I was a huge fan of the movie Braveheart at the time, and here's a sword. He had made he had made this Braveheart sword, and I thought will just trade you straight across for that Braveheart sword, and you can have my painting. And so we swapped, and just so you know that I carried this sword on the airplane as my carry-on, and this was in '97. I actually carried this Braveheart sword onto the plane as my carry-on, and I was trying to stuff it in the overhead bin, and it wouldn't fit, and so the flight attendant just grabbed it and went and put it up in the flight attendant area, and that's where it rode on my plane flight from San Antonio to Salt Lake. I would not suggest trying that nowadays, but if you could have a time machine and you can go back to 1997, you can absolutely do it. So I was reading a novel called Freehold by Michael Z. Williamson just about 7-8 years ago, and so I got on Facebook and I found Michael Z. Williams and I sent him a friend request. And as soon as I pushed friend request, I got a message back from him immediately, and he said, "Are you Brian Lee Durfee, the artist?" And I said, "Yeah, I am." And he's like, "I traded one of my Braveheart swords to you for a painting in San Antonio, Texas." And I was like, "I remember you, and I still have the sword." And he's like, "Well, I still have the painting." So it's a small. One of the things that I wanted to emphasize with this video is the publishing world is a very small world. I mean, here I am, a magic card artist with a booth, and here's Michael Z. Williams, a knife maker with a booth, and we're right next to each other in '97 at the San Antonio World Science Fiction Convention, and we're both now published authors. Michael Z. Williams publishes his Freehold series with Baen, and I publish my series with Simon & Schuster Saga Press. And, we reconnected on Facebook. It was just that, again, that has nothing to do with Game of Thrones, but we'll get to that. So let's talk about Game of Thrones. So I read Game of Thrones, when I was in college when it first came out, and I was an artist for a lot of different companies doing illustrations, and I had read a lot of fantasy books up to this time. I had read all of the David Eddings and the Raymond Feist and the Robert Jordan, Terry Goodkind, Tad Williams, all of the everything that had been out. I was aware of it. I was either aware of it or I had read it. And Game of Thrones came out, and I was astonished at just how well it was crafted and how if you want a master class in writing medieval fantasy, you need to study what George R.R. Martin has done with his Game of Thrones novels. And, he has done his research on everything medieval, and he gets it right. He knows what kind of horses do what kind of duties in battle. He knows what kind of horses do what kind of duties on a farm. He knows every intricacy of a castle and what rooms in the castles are used for what purposes. He knows everything about battles and heraldry and knights and jousting. He has done his research, which a lot of fantasy writers, they'll just skim over it and just mention a sword or a horse, but he will specifically tell you what kind of horse and what its duty is, and it's subtle, and he weaves it into the story really effortlessly. And when I was beginning to write The Forgetting Moon here and my fantasy series, I really, really did study every single thing that George R.R. Martin was doing in his books, to the point where I was actually doing word counts of his exposition. Like if he had an exposition scene or a flashback scene, I would count the amount of words and sentences and paragraphs he would use to make that scene effective. And when I would write my book, I would not exceed that word count. I would try to stay about as close as George R. R. Martin was doing, because he was doing it right. And also whenever a character would walk on scene, or whenever a character would walk into a building or walk into a forest or wherever they would go, I would pay attention to exactly how many words and how many sentences George R. R. Martin was using to describe that character, or to describe the room that the character was going into, or describe the surroundings the character was in. And I studied it, I kept notes, I made graphs, I made charts, And I really just tried to copy what he was doing as far as word count goes. So if anybody ever says, Durfee, your book is too wordy, I'm going to say, hey, it's not any more wordy than Game of Thrones, because there's a scientific study on that, and it's an actual factual truth. Kitty, well, okay, the kitty's gonna. This is pretty Miss Kitty. She's causing many problems in all the videos. She wants to knock everything I've set up down, but she can go. If one of the things about the George R. R. Martin books that struck me when I read them the first time, the Game of Thrones, and there's only a first time you can read these. I've since read them all about 5 times each. But the first time I read it, I was really taken away with how gritty the world was. At that point, there weren't really a whole lot of fantasy stories that were that kind of based in reality and that gritty. I mean, maybe Thieves' World kind of approached that. There was a few others. I know that I hadn't read anything this specifically realistic and down in the gritty dirt and grime of a medieval world, probably since I had read Pillars of the Earth about 5 or 6 years previous to that. If you've ever read Ken Follett's Pillars of the Earth, you'll know what I'm talking about. And I'll do a review of Pillars of the Earth eventually, because it is one of my favorite books. But in Pillars of the Earth, we're talking about a gritty southern England village that's building a cathedral, and there's lots of knights and death and in fantasy at the time in the mid 90s when Game of Thrones came out, we had a lot of the 1980s fantasies that were really kind of fluffy and nice and pretty, and nobody really died. I mean, if you read David Eddings, spoiler alert, but nobody ever gets killed in a David Eddings story. Still great fantasy. But in George R. R. Martin's book, people were getting maimed and killed left and right from the start, and boy, it really sort of built a lot of tension into the story that fantasy had not seen previous to that. And so, I became a huge fan of his. In fact, I have every single one of his books in both hardcover. I have them all in hardcover. I have them all in mass market paperback. I've got everything he's ever written. And I also have it all on Audible. So if for those of you thinking about buying one of my books, please buy them the same way I buy George R. R. Martin and everybody else. I buy the hardcover, the paperback, and the audiobook. I have 3 versions of everybody's books. You should have 3 versions of my book too. I'm just saying. Anyway, as far as the Game of Thrones goes, I score books on a scale of 1 to 10. I give Game of Thrones, the first book in the Song of Ice and Fire, a solid, straight up 10. I just think it is one of the best books ever written. Probably not just fantasy genre, but just in general. I mean, you can, if you want to learn how to write fantasy, you could do worse than study George R. R. Martin. He's the master of it. I know he's taken a lot of time on his last few books, but whatever. At this point, now that I'm a published writer, I kind of don't mind these guys like Pat Rothfuss and Tad Williams taking years and years between publication, because it means my publisher can just slide my book in whenever and not worried about this sales being crushed by George R. R. Martin. So at this point, I'm just like, yeah, don't ever finish it. In fact, this is my, if you want me to finish A Song of Ice and Fire, I would be willing to do it for, the small price of a part of your fortune, and we could work out a deal. I would finish that thing right up for you. I'm a fast writer. You could just, kind of like Brandon Sanderson did The Wheel of Time, you could just put my name in small type down here at the bottom. George R. R. Martin, huge. Brian Lee Durfee, somewhere in a corner. I'd be, hey, let's get it done, man. Let's do it. Let's get it done. I just also wanted to point it out that if you follow George R. R. Martin's blog, he's a huge NFL football fan of the Jets and the Giants. I'm okay with the Jets and the Giants. As you can see, I have my Raiders hat on. It's a brand new Las Vegas Raiders hat. Don't be jealous. Again, Denver Bronco fans are not welcome on my channel. Get out. That's all I really want to say. Again, my last plug, The Forgetting Moon. It's available on audio. It's available in every Barnes & Noble in the country. Also, Book 2, The Blackest Heart, is just come out. And I just turned in Book 3, The Lonesome Crown, to my publisher. It will be out soon. And please subscribe to my channel. I will be doing video reviews of books 2-3 times a week. Want to get a following, so subscribe, have your friends subscribe. Everything that every YouTube person, they want you to subscribe, hit like, do all that stuff. I want you to do it too. So thanks for watching my review of Game of Thrones. I love it. A 10 out of 10. You can't go wrong. If you don't like it, you're crazy. If you don't want to read them, and I understand people don't want to read, you can always watch the HBO show. It is fantastic. It is as good as the books. And a lot of people think the ending was rushed and hurried and kind of crappy. I think those people are out of their effing skull. I thought that the whole series from start to finish was written perfectly, and I couldn't have done it better. So please get Game of Thrones, read it if you haven't already. I know most of you already have. Again, Kitty is about to knock everything over, so I think I better end the review now.